Before I begin, I just want to thank you for the introduction. I just want to take a minute to introduce myself in my language before I begin. So, Nindelwi si Janine Metallic, Ahtlewi Listiguch, Migmwaj, Migmagwi Dlewi, Gespegawagi, Wildasi Giskuk, Uchitandel Beda Giskuk. I just want to say that as was mentioned, I'm a Mi'kmaq from Listiguch First Nation in the Gaspé area, but in my language, we call it Gespegawagi, and the larger territory is referred to as Mi'kmaqi. I want to reference that as I locate myself, as is my way of being as an Indigenous person, to locate myself, and I will introduce the rest of the panelists in a few minutes. I also want to recognize that we're, as a Mi'kmaq person, I've been living here in this territory for about 25 years. So even though I am an Indigenous person, if you want to say from Quebec, I am not from this territory, and I want to acknowledge the territory here as being the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg. And as part of my responsibility as a visitor in this territory, I also want to acknowledge that I am learning the language of this area, the language of the Gagne Ha. So I'm not quite there yet to do the full introduction in the language, but I just want to acknowledge that we are in another territory. I will introduce each of the panelists right now. So first we have Jennifer Adese. She's Otibemisiu Métis. She's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Prior to her arrival at UTM in 2018, she was an associate professor and program coordinator of Indigenous Studies in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. Her research sits at the intersection of the broader field of Indigenous studies, as well as Métis studies, cultural studies, visual sociology, and critical race theory. Our next panelist will be Sophie Pierre. Sophie Pierre served her community of Akham, the St. Mary's Indian band, in the Kakutani Truth Nation for 30 years, 26 as an elected chief, and she was the administrator of the Tribal Council for 25 years. Sophie was recognized with the Order of Canada in 2016, the Order of British Columbia in 2002, and the National Aboriginal Achievement Award in the business category in 2003. Since her retirement in 2015, Sophie has been appointed to various foundations, including the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation as a mentor and the BC Achievement Foundation. Sophie, a grandmother of 4, also spends much of her time as an elder advisor to her community and to the Kakutani Truth Nation. Finally, we have Madeleine Redfern, LLB. She was born in Iqaluit, Nunavut, formerly Frobisher Bay in Northwest Territories. She's currently the mayor of the city of Iqaluit for her second term. Madeleine has 30 years of experience working in business and governance on issues related to economic development, housing, education, employment and training, justice, and there's a long list, community service, early childhood development, and healthcare. Madeleine's expertise is grounded in partnership building and developing local capacity towards fulfilling the goal of self-governance and good governance. She has a record of working with industry, governments, Aboriginal organizations, and communities, helping to assist and identify strategies and approaches for better outcomes. So if you could please welcome our 3 panelists. Okay, we'll have the panelists present from where they're sitting. So first we have Jennifer Adese, so I'll let her.
Okay. Tonse, Jennifer Adese, Indishna Kaso. My name is Jennifer Adese, and I'm of the Otapemsawak, also known as the Métis Nation. That's the beginning and end of my Cree language abilities. My grandmother chose not to pass the language on for however much you can make a choice under colonization. My father was born and raised in Amasquatchie, Waskahigan, Beaver Hills House, or Edmonton. And all of my Métis and Nehewak family continue to live and work around there, with some extended cousins in Tulita in the Northwest Territories and in the Athabasca region of Alberta. I was born in the Coast Salish Territory and raised in Haudenosaunee Territory. I've been all over the place with my non-Indigenous mother's adoptive family. It's an honor to be here today in the traditional and unceded homelands of some of my dearest colleagues who are Gagne Ha here in Jojage. Under the banner of reconciliation, I deeply wish that they were here to guide us in our conversation today. As you heard, I'm currently an associate professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga and St. George, where I'm involved in graduate teaching and supervision in the Department of Sociology. Prior to that, moving to the Mississauga's territory, I was in the territory of the Omama-Wininewak, or the Downriver people, the Downriver Algonquin people at Carleton University. I flew in last night from Kijisibi, from Ottawa, after spending the day with Les Femmes Michif Otapemsawak, or Women of the Métis Nation. They were holding a policy gathering wherein they invited women from each of the 5 member provinces of the Métis National Council and Les Femmes Michif Otapemsawak, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, to attend a gathering and discuss areas of policy concern for Métis women, girls, and for our LGBTQ two-spirit Métis people. I've been involved with them in various capacities for the better part of my academic career, stretching back to my time as a graduate student going on 13 years. I've watched them grow from a branch under the thumb of the Métis National Council into their own autonomous national Indigenous organization, formally registered as required by Canadian law. Much of my research of late has been geared towards looking at Métis women's political participation, a neglected area of study for all those interested in the Canada-Métis relationship, or Métis-Canada relationship, as I like to say it. As a Métis woman, though, while this may not be of much interest to anybody else, it's of a massive amount of interest to me. Because Métis women have confronted not only racism within the Métis Nation and within Canada, but they've confronted sexism at home and in Canada more widely. The federal government has long been of the position, expressed as early as the 1980s at the time of constitutional negotiations, that Métis women can and should channel our participation in constitutional processes through the goodwill of largely male-dominated organizations. Leadership of the 4 national Aboriginal organizations in the early 1980s were of also the attitude that all Indigenous women could be adequately represented by the 4 organizations dominated by men, and did not require our own separate voice in constitutional negotiations. Wherein funding was generated for Métis women's political participation, it was channeled through the MNC. In particular, the MNC was given $100,000 by the Government of Canada in order to consult with Métis women, and to, quote, get their input as to what the main concerns are in reference to the Constitution. 12 women attended a meeting during the MNC General Assembly held in Winnipeg in November 1983. Métis women from that point were continued to be expected to channel their political organization through the goodwill of MNC. In most cases, such as the charges brought by Sheila Janai in the 1990s, the money given by the federal government to MNC rarely filtered down from the top to meaningfully include Métis women in MNC efforts. By the mid-2000s, Métis women were being consistently denied separate funding from places like Status of Women Canada on the auspices, and at this point I was involved with them, that we had to be our own organization independent from MNC. In about 2010, Les Femmes Michif Otapemsawak formally established itself as its own nonprofit organization, and the current president, Melanie Omenio, holds a seat within the MNC structure. In the years since, it has held various pockets of funding transferred from the federal government, and in the Canada-Métis Nation Accord signed in 2017, Métis women are identified as one of the priorities for future years. We are told that this accord arose from Canada's commitment to a nation-to-nation relationship with Métis people. In the 2018 Memorandum of Understanding with the Métis Nation of British Columbia, the agreement is flagged as a journey, a shared journey toward reconciliation. Reconciliation then with Métis people is imagined as an endpoint. It's a journey toward reconciliation. It's not an ongoing, forever livable process. A point we will get to if we make enough agreements, enough funding is channeled, and enough platitudes and symbolic gestures are offered. From the outside, reconciliation with the Métis Nation looks like a service delivery relationship at best. And Métis people, desperate for something after over a century of calling ourselves the forgotten people, will do anything for some measure of redress. We accept it, and our leadership become banners for reconciliation and for this journey. You can only keep people in a state of abject poverty for so long before we will compromise many things to be remembered. I worry then, if we are being remembered now, it is in many ways for the wrong reasons, because what we never get anywhere on is land. There are no promises to stitch back the communities that the Government of Canada calculatedly tore apart in its nation-building project. Métis people can sign off on and give symbolic agreements to things like pipelines, but are denied the meaningful repatriation of land, which is at the heart of what all forms of reconciliation have to be about. For Métis women, the gap between what is said and what is done is never more clear than in light of the national inquiry into Indigenous women and girls who've gone missing and or been murdered. And I say that inspired by the work of Althea Prince, who worked on challenging the dehumanization of Black people, because we're talking about Indigenous women and girls who are people first, who are not defined to their families or the rest of us who care about them by the violence visited upon them. We put their peoplehood first. In light of this, the inquiry has failed to take Métis women and girls seriously, and this was the subject of my presentation to the Métis women's delegation yesterday. In the interim report released in 2017, the inquiry, also under the banner of some form of reconciliation, stated it could not offer specific recommendations to Métis women at that stage in the absence of data available regarding Métis women's experiences. The report yet clearly indicates and identifies that Métis women experience more violence than non-Indigenous women and girls, deal with racist and sexist stereotypes, and live it through poor socioeconomic conditions. But in the absence of, it seems, focused studies, it could say and offer little more. The preliminary recommendations made indication that there was no plan, or it made no indication that there was a plan to address these research gaps. What I've been told by Métis women on the ground, by Métis families who have been impacted by the disappearance or murder of their loved ones, that they have not been contacted, they have not been supported, and that the team working on the Métis part has in fact done very little with and for Métis women. Last year, Le Femme Chif Otapemsawak boycotted the extension of the inquiry timeline and also a guided national dialogue to be held on last minute's notice in Edmonton. When invited to participate, I declined because whoever edited the invitation forgot to take out Inuit and input Métis in the invitation. This is a microaggression visited on Métis women involved in these processes. Métis women have been actually a central part of pushing through various national Aboriginal women's summits going all the way back to 2007 for the inquiry itself. I attended each and every one up till 2012. Reconciliation with the Métis doesn't really include women. In the federal budget recently announced, $30 million is being allocated to MNC in the name of Métis veterans, many who've already passed on to the spirit world. Nothing is allocated to Métis women in the year that this report is due to be released. And so, as we also very recently found out, the federal government is channeling funding to Les Femmes Chif Otapemsawak because we've petitioned them to write our own counter-report to make up for the guaranteed absences that will be there. But our report is due at the end of April. If this is reconciliation that doesn't root out the seedy underbelly of anti-Métis sexism and racism, and largely anti-Indigenous sexism and racism that this country was founded on, I'm not sure what it is supposed to do.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I forgot to mention earlier, each of the panelists will have 5 to 7 minutes approximately for their opening remarks, after which time we will entertain questions from the audience. So we'll continue now with the second panelist, with the Honorable Sophie Pierre.
Thank you. Kisukyukiet, piniskil, smaknek, sukil kokni now san meyet kikusilwam, amak is, Gagne Ha. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you today. And I want to acknowledge and thank the Haudenosaunee for allowing me and for allowing all of us to be meeting here on your lands, the Haudenosaunee, as they did with the Anishinaabe. Canada's reconciliation with First Peoples of this land must start with recognition. Recognition that those whom Canada blankets as Indigenous are in fact distinct nations with distinct languages, distinct cultures, homelands, and governing structures. I am Ktunaxa, and my people have lived in the Rocky Mountain Trench for thousands of years. Our homelands, Amak is Ktunaxa, stretch from the Big Bend of the Columbia River, as it's known today, at an area called Yakleke, to present-day Missoula, Montana. That is the area called Ktuhulnana. There's no 49th parallel dividing Amak is Ktunaxa. Our language is an isolate, meaning it stands alone among the world's languages. And our fluent speakers within our entire nation number less than 100 individuals. As the original peoples of Turtle Island, we have been hidden under the blanket identities that the colonial governments covered us with. Many of us have suffocated or are near death. In the 40-plus years that I have been involved in what is fondly known as Indian politics, I have been called many things. I've been called an Indian, a Native, Aboriginal, First Nations, and now Indigenous. And those are just the politically correct terms. Hopefully the English language has kind of run out of ideas about what they can call us. But in all that time, I have only been Ktunaxa, a citizen of the Ktunaxa Nation. This identity lives in my heart. It's not on a piece of paper. The culture of the colonizer is paper-based, where relationships are likely to be negotiated and written down, not built in a process of being lived. The spirit of the law is forgotten, and the focus becomes on the letter of the law. As Ktunaxa, we recognize the nations around us, the Syilx, the Shukwaapmuk, the Blackfoot, and other nations with whom we have shared thousands of years of interaction, of history. The Ktunaxa recognizes its own citizens. If you can trace your Ktunaxa roots, then you are Ktunaxa. And it does not matter what some other government says. When we accept the labels that are generalizable and portable to accommodate other governments, we chip away at our own identity. In 2015, when the TRC report was tabled and the spotlight was directed to Canada's true history regarding residential schools, it came as an incredible surprise to many, many people. I find that very, very hard to believe, considering the number of reports, inquiries, royal commissions, and numerous court decisions in the previous 4 to 5 decades. And yet, it was like no one had ever really heard about any of this before. Even today, I still have Canadians that say they don't understand why they never heard about residential schools, its lasting legacy, or the realities of the Indian Act legislation. But then, none of that history was ever taught, not in our schools, not even in our colleges and universities, certainly wasn't talked about in our churches or in other places reserved for spirituality. And so, Canada's agenda today on reconciliation must begin with making that history right, with recognition. The calls to action from the TRC report are definitely resulting in some positive changes, some positive movement around education, justice, business interactions and relationships, and so on. However, it's not based on a firm foundation of recognition. And today, the federal government is in a very unusual and unique place to begin true reconciliation. And I'm not sure that it's fully appreciated. Never mind the apologies, the payments. I'm talking about true recognition, true reconciliation through recognition of our nations. Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Bill, is an opportunity for the federal government to recognize our nations with their distinct languages, distinct lands, homelands, distinct governing structures, and for Canada to begin true nation-to-nation relationships. Once we have that recognition that's got a firm foundation based on our languages, that can then lead to reconciliation. Reconciliation through such governing authority as is being tabled through the Child Welfare Act, Bill C-92. Actioning modern-day treaties, which is a true self-determination, actioning that is rooted in recognition of nations, and that is real and lasting reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move to the next panelist. We have Mayor Madeleine Redfern, Mayor of Iqaluit in Nunavut.
Thank you. Good morning. Udlakut Tungasagitsi Ovunga Madeleine Redfern. Reconciliation, as you've heard, is not only difficult, it requires an awful lot of work. And I agree with Sophie. It begins with recognition, or as often our Inuit people and our elders, acknowledgement. Acknowledgement about our history, acknowledgement about what happened, acknowledgement about our reality, and acknowledgement about our needs. I had the distinct pleasure of participating in a commission back home called the Kakutani Truth Commission. And the reason why this commission was created was for the very purpose of looking at the shared history of Inuit in the Eastern Arctic and Canada. Why did we do this? In part because after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples had produced all their reports, there had only been one about the Arctic and one about Inuit, and that was the high Arctic relocations. I'd have to say, for the most part, that was a well-researched and well-documented report. But there were many other issues that our people spoke to that got no traction, got no acknowledgement, and was not included. So what were those issues? There were issues around what happened to our dogs, what other relocations, as well as a whole host of other issues. So after some much politicking that of Inuit in northern Quebec, of the Nunavik region, of Inuit in the eastern Arctic, of the Kakutani region, there was little to no interest whatsoever by the federal government to have another commission. And in fact, the allegations, or just simple statement of fact, was to be dismissed. Despite the fact that the media gave some traction to this conflict, to this unreconciled history, they eventually led to the RCMP writing or undertaking their own inquiry. Not surprisingly, the RCMP report said the following. One, that Inuit were lying, specifically our elders. Two, if such a thing did happen to the killing of our dogs, it wasn't done by them. Three, the only reason why Inuit were complaining is that they wanted money. You can imagine how well that report went down back home. So what did Inuit do? I have to applaud and commend my leadership for deciding to create their own commission, to fund their own commission with our own money. Nunavik proceeded with an independent commission, and interestingly enough, chose a Quebec judge to lead that commission, in part because of the rules in this province around commissions. Whereas back home, we decided that we would actually have a retired Inuk judge from Labrador. They asked me to join as the executive director, and I said I would, but under a couple conditions. One is that I didn't want our commission to focus on the issue of only what happened to our dogs or relocations. From what I had read, which was extensive, of my own history, I knew there was more. I knew that government policy and government decisions that affected our people was extensive. What was rather also, I didn't realize at the time until well into the work of our commission, was that how there was virtually no one from my people who had actually published our history, our own history. Everything that had been published or was accessible or available was published by non-Inuit academics, people who had gone up north as a nurse for 6 months, wrote books. I said, let's go. Let's do it. So the mandate of the Kakutani Truth Commission was to look at the period of 1950 to 1975, was to look at that period of transition not only for Inuit but for Canada, to look at it as a shared history, to look at the government decisions and policies and how they affected Inuit. We had approximately $3 million in 3 years to do it, to visit 13 communities, to do all the historical research as well that had been written, not just historical research, historical documentation. So how did we proceed? With an ambitious plan of traveling to all our communities, as well as accessing every government archive and record we possibly could. One of the very first tasks that I thought was important was to reach out to the RCMP, was to reach out to at that point, INAC, Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, was to reach out to our territorial government, to reach out to our Inuit other organizations, to share with them and explain why we were doing this work, to explain the broader mandate. Anyone who knows me, I'm fairly stubborn or relentless, and I work at all levels. So within a short period of time, we started in about November, we had a meeting with the RCMP commissioner in Ottawa in about the end of January. I think they were nervous. But we showed up. We explained our mandate, the work. By then, we'd had our budget laid out and our work plan. And with talking to Commissioner Paulson at the time and his aides, he was able to wrap his head around that we were going to take an approach that really wanted to look at this history, not just of the RCMP and not just of the sled dogs, but more broadly. They were very surprised. They were very interested. And at the end of that meeting, we had the support of the RCMP. They gave us full access to their records. They gave us access to their database of all the RCMP members who had served in the Arctic. They gave us access to even if the possible use of their RCMP airplane and the ability to take their records and digitize it and put it in a database to translate it. Anyone who's in law knows that that's significant, the issues around copyright. And what took longer was the joint press release, getting it translated and approved. But once we issued it, I could not believe that the northern media, the southern media, did not pick up the story. Despite years of stories about the conflict of the RCMP and Inuit, that bothered me tremendously. We had worked so hard for just that initial act of reconciliation to begin actually to do our work with the support of these government agencies. And the media would not tell that story. They wouldn't tell it back home, and they wouldn't tell it across the country. The role of media is huge and extremely important. It educates, it informs or misinforms our society. It can set up the dynamics that allow us to know each other better or to perpetuate the stereotypes and to perpetuate the conflicts. So even though that I have only shared with you one tiny little aspect of this valuable body of work that we did, and the outcomes of that work were phenomenal. The stories that our people shared often for the first time with even their family, let alone with their broader community. The work that we published was not just one final report, but we actually, because I'm a workaholic and I drive my poor staff wild, we produced 20 products. So there's the main report, and then there are sub-reports that go into further detail into a number of subjects. Relocations, what happened to those dogs. There's a couple of other special studies. We actually picked and pulled apart that RCMP report in actually a very fascinating critique, how and why they did the work they did and all the mistakes that they made. There's one also that if you're particularly interested in federalism and with respect to Inuit in the Arctic, we produced a report or a special study called The Official Mind of Colonialism, Canadian Colonialism. And maybe what I'll just end with is that for those who have a particular affinity or interest in understanding government, why it does what it does, how it thinks and develops policy. I always thought prior to even starting the commission work, that the government was schizophrenic as it comes to, interacting with our people. The commission work solidified that opinion. The government functions with more than one mind. Often it is to assimilate, or the other is to preserve. And I call that often sort of romantic racism. And often it's the cheapest thing that the government can do, is just to leave us alone. So it's a form of neglect, but it does it with supposedly good intentions. So if you're interested, I would strongly recommend reading the final report of the Kakutani Truth Commission. If anything particularly piques your interest, there's, as I said, about almost another 8 sub-studies and reports, and then there are 13 community histories that we produced. And why did we produce those? Because it turned out that we didn't have our own community histories from our own perspectives written. And so at the end of the day, those 20 documents is our legacy. And it is the beginning of reconciliation. It helps explain the dynamics in our communities with each other. It helps to explain the dynamics in a relationship between Inuit and non-Inuit. It helps explain the dynamics and relationship between Inuit and government. Because those exact same mindsets and policies and approaches exist today. And that is what I learned, is that if we don't know our history, is we just keep doing the same things over and over again. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we are the ones that are ultimately harmed.
Thank you, Madeline. Just to remind the audience, the objective of this panel, we all know the title, it was titled Indigenous Reconciliation. I would have just called it Reconciliation, personally. But on the topic of reconciliation and the objective of this panel, it really is to discuss the state of reconciliation in Canada. And also in the context of today's day, talking about federalism. How does reconciliation relate to federalism and also intergovernmental relations? And so in this context, we're also looking at the next federal election campaign and so on. And so I want to thank all the panelists for highlighting different priorities, if you will, for looking at reconciliation from an Indigenous perspective, or from many different Indigenous perspectives. Just to recap a bit, Jennifer Adese was saying the important role of Métis women, particularly the relationship and how best to meaningfully include Métis women in discussions around reconciliation is important. Talking about the idea that Métis are denied, conversations around land, discussions around land, the Métis are often overlooked. And as was mentioned, reconciliation often excludes Métis women. Sophie Pierre highlighted 2 very important issues of recognition in relation to nations, and also recognition in relation to land. What I also wanted to add was just the idea that language, is embedded in all of these recognitions as well. And so in the spirit of that, looking at the recognitions of nations around us is something that we have to consider. And I think even in the context in which we find ourselves here, we could do more to recognize the nations within our own territory. So reconciliation is really about making things right, which is what I took from what Sophie Pierre was sharing, making things right and doing that by recognizing nation and land, and then around that, the conversations around different legislation related to languages, not only languages, but languages, child welfare, and so on. And finally, with Mayor Madeleine Redfern, recognition, and adding onto that the idea of not just recognition, but acknowledgement, acknowledging our different histories of the different regions, and also looking at how the federal government is often dismissing a lot of that history. There are multiple histories, and as was mentioned, we have a shared history, but it's also important to recognize the diversity of all the different Indigenous nations. And so by going back as Indigenous peoples and looking back at our own history and through our perspectives and looking at our own stories about what has happened to us, as was mentioned, it's quite an extensive history, and it's something that we really need to recognize if we're going to talk about truth and reconciliation. Oftentimes we jump too fast to reconciliation. I think we need to remind ourselves, as was mentioned here throughout the panel, that we need to talk about the truth as well. And so I open now the floor to questions from the audience. If you have questions, we'll just is there a microphone? The microphone is at the back of the room. Okay, so we have a question. Could I also ask that you introduce yourself before you ask the question, and to keep the questions focused and somewhat brief? Oh, are there any questions?
I'm running it. Okay. Actually, I do have a question, if no one else is going to. So my name is Aidan Fair. I'm an undergrad student here at McGill in political science and Canadian studies. And one of the things that I'm doing research on right now is the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, and how it remains on the books in Canada, even though First Nation band councils are no longer required, or at least enforced by the Canadian executive, to publish financial statements of the bands, but as well as band council remuneration. So my question really is, in the spirit of recognition and reconciliation, is this something that is continuing to inhibit the relationship, or in your perspectives, if you're comfortable sharing that, is it an effective tool that can be perhaps amended to suit its purpose better?
The way that the act was brought in was with the impression that supposition that First Nations, as they were called, and I guess as they still are called, were somehow not able to govern. And it stems from this whole concept of First Nations simply being the Indigenous people, the nations simply being the creations of the federal government through the Indian Act, and somehow they're not able to govern. Well, I can tell you that under the Indian Act, there is no ability to govern. That was never the intent. It was never ever supposed back in 1872, when the Indian Act was brought into place, that those Indian people would last any more than 1 or 2 generations. So it wasn't brought up, it wasn't set up to allow for governing. When we move towards actual recognition between the federal government and the First Peoples nations with their languages in their homelands, actually governing under their governing structures, then the intent of that particular piece of legislation is something that is going to be more effective, rather than this whole idea about Indian bands and the way that the structure is right now. And I speak to you as a person who was as elected chief for 26 years, and I know I had absolutely no governing authority under that.
There's another question. Yes, go ahead.
This is a question for Sophie Pierre. You're from British Columbia, long experience. BC stands out in contrast to the other 4 Western provinces and indeed Ontario, in that there are almost no historic treaties and only a small number of modern treaties have been signed, the best known, of course, being the MISC. At the same time, there are literally hundreds of agreements that have been signed with the provincial government and many, many First Nations across the province. I'd invite your comments on how this dynamic affects the governance of First Nations communities, bearing in mind that the federal government, of course, still has its role, even though it's different because of the absence of treaties over most of the territory.
Thank you for that question. Yes, in 1992, the nations in British Columbia made a concerted effort, after long negotiations with both the province and the federal governments, to create a process where we could actually get into modern-day treaty making based on recognition of our nations, based on our languages and our actual homelands. And it was a great day it was a day of celebration. You know, we figured we really had something going here. And I can say we because my signature is on that document. We all figured that we were going to have modern day treaties by the year 2000. We are in 2019, and we have, as you indicated, very few of those treaties. And it was because the federal government and the provincial government very quickly reverted back to their old ways, which was dealing with individual Indian bands, looking at the Indian Act, bringing that forward instead of actually negotiating in good faith. We immediately had a return to the extinguishment, language around extinguishment. It's incredible that the only time that there's ever any kind of recognition language, it's when it's recognition to extinguish. But when it's recognition to live together and to move forward into the future, that kind of language disappears. And so yes, we have a process, and I was Chief Commissioner for 6 years within that process, and I believe very strongly that what we have is something that could work, and that what we need is actual meaningful negotiations that can lead to lasting agreements, and that is really what, when I talk about recognition being necessary in order to reach reconciliation, the true measure of reconciliation is to have a negotiated treaty that is honorably implemented. That's the catch. Thank you.
We have another question?
Yeah.
If we could bring the microphone to the... If you have a question, could I ask you to please stand so I can see? Oh, thank you. And introduce yourself, please.
My name is Megan Aker. I'm from the Woodland Cree Band in Alberta. And my question is, I'm also a nurse, and I'm doing a Master's of Nursing here at McGill. And in my experience in health, I've noticed that funding is often divided up between Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. And there's kind of this competition that happens between the groups. And unfortunately, that creates tension. And I was wondering what we can do as, as a First Nation person who also works with Métis health and Inuit health, how to avoid that tension.
Well, maybe I could speak to it. I used to live in Ottawa, and I can tell you that as one of the sort of founding members of Wabano, which is an Aboriginal health center in Ottawa, is that we came together, all 3 Indigenous groups, and worked 4 years intensively to bring that about, in part because there was a shared reality and recognition that all Indigenous people in our urban setting were not getting adequate healthcare services in the mainstream institutions, and that there would be value in seeing our own space. And at the end of the day, I'm happy to say that after gosh, it must be 25 or 30 years that Owabano exists. So, but I agree with you, outside of that, it can be set up to be very competitive and to pit against each other. And so the best way is to actually sometimes is to have those internal sort of dialogue and build our own internal relationships so that we find that as more united, you can stand. And also maybe another example I will use is that there are times where you want something distinct from each other. So I also helped set up the Inuit Head Start in Ottawa, and initially the federal government was unrolling a program where there would be only one Head Start in that community, and the Inuit said, you know, we want our own, and they were going to actively and politically speak out against the First Nations. And I said, well, I don't think that's a good approach. Why don't we actually speak to the First Nations and say we want our own, and for the following reasons why. And in the end, they agreed and they supported our political effort to have our separate own entity. And so they became our ally rather than our competitor. So you have to find, I think, political, solutions that don't antagonize within our own different Indigenous groups. Because at the end of the day, I don't think it usually works very well or to our advantage when we work against each other.
Would anybody else on the panel like to add to what was said, particularly around the funding surrounding health or other areas where we have recognition of Métis, Inuit, First Nations, but I just want to remind, or just to add, maybe myself, just to add to what was mentioned and through the question, thank you for the question, just to add that and remind the audience what was said earlier by Sophie Pierre is that as Indigenous people, we've been covered, as was mentioned, under these blanket identities, and oftentimes sort of like merged onto these three major categories of people as First Nations, Inuit, Métis, but that there is that diversity of nations. And I remind people of that word nation because I think, as was expressed through this panel, is that that's what we're seeking is recognition of nations, Indigenous nations. And a reminder again that here in what we call Quebec, we have 11 different nations in this territory, in this area. And so that's one of the things I just want to highlight and emphasize again for, a lot of you who are from this area, that we need more of that recognition. And I think some of those conversations or those tensions that we talk about, potentially could be eliminated if we started changing that conversation to talk about how we communicate and relate to each other, intergovernmentally, as nations. And so I just want to add that to the conversation to remind the audience. And I see we have another question.
Graham Fraser, visiting professor at MISC. Sophie Pierre mentioned C91, which is the Indigenous Languages Act. My brief reading of the Act, I had the sense that its main focus is creating a commissioner and a commissioner's office that would not be an independent commissioner like the Commissioner of Official Languages, but would report to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, that there would partly be a role of investigating complaints, but partly a preservation role. And the initial reaction was quite negative from the Inuit organizations, in part because of the Nunavut Official Languages Act, which is much broader than the Federal Official Languages Act, because it places obligations on the private sector to provide services in the Inuit language. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that you saw this as an opportunity. I'm wondering where you see that opportunity and how you can see the government proceeding so that it actually achieves the objective of preserving, protecting, and developing Indigenous languages. And I'd be interested in hearing from Mayor Redfern her diagnosis of the success so far of the legislation in Nunavut, which we've seen at least one commissioner of official languages in Nunavut resign out of frustration because of the lack of progress.
Thank you. If I may start the discussion on that. Thank you very much for asking that question. I was hoping somebody would ask, and if you hadn't, I would have somehow slipped it in there.
I had one question.
But yeah, I think that in this budget, it is suggested that there's $333.7 million over 5 years that has been allocated, that has been identified for Indigenous languages. And the present, what is being suggested is largely around creating a commission for preservation. I'm not interested in just preserving the Ktunaxa language. I am interested in using it every day. I am interested in revitalizing that language. I am interested in ensuring that anyone who has chosen to make their home in Amak es Ktunaxa realizes and understands and uses. And in fact, we have that within our school system. There are very few children of any ethnicity in our school system that do not know what Kisukyukyat is, that do not know what our creation story is, and that in fact, the places where they live have Ktunaxa names. So we're talking about having a vibrant, living language. We're not talking just about preserving it somewhere in a dusty old library. And my question would be that we look at it from a point of investment. What is the return on investment? Actually, on anything that the federal government spends in terms of its Indigenous budget. But what is the return on investment, and how are we going to gauge that over the next 5 years on this $333.7 million? I think it's very important to know that if we're simply going to add to the bureaucracy the way that usually happens, there's going to be very little in terms of real investment. That was the question as Chief Commissioner for the BC Treaty Commission the very first year that I was Chief Commissioner, that I took to the Federal Budget Committee to say, how are we going to measure the return on investment? And to me, that's very, very important, because to me, it's not just a matter of creating another entity, an entity that's going to make decisions, probably back east, and I'm way out west, is going to make decisions about how we might preserve our language. That's not going to create a whole lot of return on investment. And why do we keep throwing good money after bad? Thank you.
So with respect to the question that was specific for Nunavut, there's definitely been a lot of challenges in implementing our own Official Languages Act as well, which recognizes the Inuit language as an official language as well. And then in addition, we have the Inuit Language Protection Act. The act that creates Nunavut has a language provision that allows our territory to promote our language. I agree. I don't want to simply see our language promoted. I want to see our language advanced. Given that we have probably some of the highest numbers of Indigenous language speakers back home, but even so, in the last 25 years, we still see language loss happening. And why? When you have your own territory, you have your own land claim agreement, you have the majority of the population are Inuit, 85% in our own territory. Well, it's because despite legislation or despite the existence of a treaty, what is absolutely key and needed is a proper implementation plan. And with implementation plan, you need resources. So that's why I think, the language commissioner that you mentioned resigned, did so out of frustration, was not seeing the real political commitment attached to ensuring that our language is properly used. This past week, our own territorial legislature decided to suspend or to put on hold some key objectives that were stated in legislation that we would have Inuktitut taught in our schools at a certain level because they couldn't meet them. So in order to actually achieve your stated goals or objectives, you need to work with people, you need to create plans with people, and you need to actually see achievable, measurable results. They don't happen on their own, and the constant sort of thing which our government tends to say is language, starts at home, and there's a lot of truth to that, but if your home doesn't have your Indigenous language, it doesn't start there. So you have to actively bring it into the schools. We're still in a situation that Inuktitut is only available up until grade 3 in our territory. And imagine the state of your language skills if it stops at age 8 or 9. You do not have the complexity of the terms, you do not have the complexity of the concepts, and that is our problem and why we're seeing the language loss and language erosion.
Yeah, and for me, I would just quickly add to that in the context of the Métis Nation, I mean, like I said, we're really happy when anything might impact us. But for me, it is also gender-based. This conversation is gender-based because traditionally, Métis children learn the language from Métis women. They learned it in the home. Men were gone, often for very long periods of time, working on the land, voyaging, doing their labor. So we acknowledge that women have traditionally been the heart of the home and the heart of the language. But again, this is something that doesn't get considered in the context of the framework. Yes, structures of employment have changed, but largely Métis women still work within the home. And so there is, for me, a lack of a gender-based conversation about this and what the implications and impact of this will be. How will we address and support Métis women in the home and going out to work, but who we recognize as the core of cultural transmission for Métis people. So that's another thing. And we're not even really at a stage of talking about that internally yet either. So we'll see.
There's another question.
Hi, my name is Greer Nicholson. I'm from Toronto originally. I'm studying law at McGill here, and this year I've been taking a long course in Anishinaabe constitutionalism with Erin Mills, which is great. But we've been talking about Indigenous legal revitalization and the potential for that to be a vehicle for communities to project their identities, reinforce their identities and their own deep norms. But at the same time, there seems to be a tension with sort of government requirements to translate constitutionalism, legal norms into sort of liberal terms and human rights frameworks. And I wondered if you could speak to that tension and whether sort of, I don't know, a fundamentalist stance is the right way of terming it, but whether it makes sense to sort of dig heels in and say, like, we're not going to, adopt constitutions and stuff that don't reflect our deep norms, or whether it makes sense to sort of do that in order to get those powers devolved and then engage in a maybe a more profound attempt to enact the community's norms in other ways.
So I'm aware of a number of First Nations that are in the process of developing their own constitutions. And constitutions by nature is an act of sovereignty. It's stating, we exist as a nation and on what terms and basis. It's not up for any other nation to dictate what the Canadian Constitution says, or Canadian government to dictate what any other sort of nation constitution should be. But I do also think, the creating yourself and the terms belongs to that internal group. When and if there are any constitutional, quote, conflicts that happen because of, terms of your constitution may not, mesh or align nicely with the Canadian Constitution, well, guess what? There's a whole host of problems with the Canadian Constitution that we see regularly go before the Supreme Court of Canada because we're a confederation. We've got Section 91, we've got Section 92 with the division of the powers between the provinces and the federal government, and there are regular conflicts all the time. Whether you can buy beer and bring it across from one province to another, whether you can as a tradesperson or as a professional, can I get licensed to practice in one region and move to another? I mean, that happens all the time. So it's not something that I think inherently we should be afraid of, because, for the most part, Canadians are not that concerned or fearful of the Constitution, even when conflicts arise. We figure it out, and if we can't negotiate a political solution of those conflicts, we go to the courts. But at the same time, I recognize there are problems even with some of the Supreme Court decisions. I'm surprised, and it's just the way that it works in Confederation. It's not perfect, and sometimes it gets a little messy, and sometimes we don't even get it right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to say a few words about that topic matter too. But first of all, would you please extend my greetings to Aaron? He's a Trudeau scholar, so I have had the pleasure of meeting with him and listening to him. So very pleased that you're working with him. So let him know that I have a lot of respect for him. In terms of the Constitution, our nation has recently brought that back to the forefront of working with our people on that. When we entered into treaty making and modern day treaty making, we entered in 1994 because it was the process that I had described earlier, where we figured we were going to have something that was actually going to be meaningful very quickly. We have never, ever agreed that we would sign anything that talked about extinguishment. And so we have instead made a very deliberate choice to use the modern day treaty-making process to rebuild our nation. And that's exactly what we've been doing. And we now have situations where the discussion earlier that was going on about providing health services, about providing child welfare services, any of those services, education services, housing services. Our Kakutani Nation is the governing body. We are the governing body within our Kakutani that is in the part that's in British Columbia and Southeast BC. And we enter into agreements. We have protocols with the Métis Nation in our area, and we provide all the services. In British Columbia, we took over Canada Health for what was called Indian Health. We took that over, and we run that totally for British Columbia, and we deal with our interior health regions through the province. So as we were rebuilding our nation, we had one attempt at the Constitution, and it was too soon. The Constitution, as you know, is the document that is the written expression of the people. And so now we have come back to it. Now we are ready to finalize our Constitution. And that is the work that we are doing right now. And we had the question when we were talking, we have concepts in there like Agnamutstilil, which is natural law. We talk about natural law in our Constitution. And so we do have people who say, well, are we really going to be allowed to do that? And we say, I mean, who's to stop us? Only other Ktunaxa can stop us from practicing Agnamutstilil. We know what Agnamutstilil is in Amak-es Ktunaxa, and that is in our Constitution. So that's the Constitution work that we are now ready to be doing. We've also gone through and are still involved in a very difficult process, very challenging, around citizenship. I mentioned in my presentation that you're born Ktunaxa, you die Ktunaxa. Don't matter what the heck you do, where you go and live, you're still going to be Ktunaxa. You can't get away from it. Particularly, and when you want to, if you've been away for a long time and you're coming home, you trace your roots. If your roots are Ktunaxa, you are Ktunaxa. No one can change that. So we've got all this work around now around citizenship, because it's the citizens of the Ktunaxa Nation who will vote on our Constitution and adopt our Constitution, and who will vote on and adopt any type of modern day agreement that we're going to have with Canada. So that's been a real exercise. It's tough. You know, we've got people that are worried about, you know, I mean, it's like particularly our relatives in the U.S. They have in their regulations and in their constitutions blood quantum, and so that creates a real issue. And those are the kind of issues that, when you're serious in your nation rebuilding, those kind of questions are the ones that you take on.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions. I'm very aware of time. We are actually past the noon hour at this moment. If there are any pressing questions, I would invite you to come see the panelists during the lunch hour, if you will. But at this point, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. It's been a great discussion, great generation of questions from the audience. I still have tons of questions I wish I could ask. But I just want to say that, again, and reminding, as what was just said, is that you know, we're still, as Indigenous people, very much connected to our places, our lands, our nations, and with that, you know, the conversation around languages is very important as well. I'm glad that was brought up. And education is another piece that we didn't get to today, but I'm hoping that we'll continue the conversation, like I said, over the break and throughout the day, if you will. And so in my language, to thank all of the panelists, I would say, Walalio. And because I'm a beginner speaker or learner of the language of this territory, of the Gagne Ha Nation, I would say Niawa, or Niawa to say thank you, but Niawa Goa, thank you very much for all your discussions and for sharing today. So thank you very much.